Sofía Delgado was 12 years old when she disappeared. Born in the rural town of Candelaria, Valle del Cauca, Colombia, she was a bright, loving child, the only daughter of Andrés Delgado and Lady Zúñiga. Known for her cheerfulness and close bond with her family, Sofía was an innocent girl, untouched by the complexities of the outside world. She had no social media presence, and her life had been marked by the security of a small-town existence, surrounded by her parents, grandparents, uncles, and cousins. On Sunday, September 29, 2024, Sofía spent the day with her extended family at her paternal grandmother's house. The afternoon passed with typical familial warmth, laughter, shared meals, and stories. Everything seemed ordinary, but that was before Sofía left the gathering. She told her aunt that she had some leftover dog shampoo from a recent grooming session and suggested that they could bathe her aunt's dog together. The decision to allow Sofía to walk alone back to her house was one made in good faith. The distance was short, a mere 5-minute walk, a route she had traveled countless times before. There was no reason to suspect that this time something would go horribly wrong. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Sofía had not returned. At first, her family thought little of it, assuming she had gotten distracted along the way or was caught up with some neighbor or friend. But when the minutes turned into an hour and she still had not appeared, concern began to creep in. Her father, Andrés, was the first to act. He mounted his motorcycle and headed in the direction of their home, but when he arrived, he found the door to the house closed, just as he had left it. Inside, everything was undisturbed. The dog shampoo, just as Sofía had left it, sat untouched. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. His daughter had never made it home. An immediate search ensued. Family members began combing the surrounding area, questioning neighbors, and visiting nearby properties, but there was no sign of Sofía. As the minutes stretched into hours, they were forced to alert the local authorities. A missing persons report was filed, and the investigation began. The authorities, aware of the severity of the case given Sofía's age, initiated a search operation with urgency. Local police officers, assisted by volunteers and members of the community, scoured the area. But it wasn't until the following day that the first significant clue came to light. A grainy security camera footage captured an image of a girl walking down a nearby street. It was difficult to make out any details, but her parents recognized her instantly by the clothes she was wearing: a purple shirt, a white pair of shorts. That fleeting image was the only tangible lead the authorities had. But it only deepened the mystery. The search expanded. Investigators began asking around, gathering statements from neighbors and local residents. According to reports, an unknown white car had been seen driving through the area at the time Sofía had disappeared. This would become the first real piece of evidence, and it would mark the beginning of a search for answers that would soon spiral into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The initial response was swift. Police gathered statements from witnesses. A psychological profile of Sofía was built based on interviews with her family and teachers. She was described as a girl who had always been close to her family, particularly her mother. She had never before strayed from her path, and it was unthinkable that she would willingly leave her family behind. The narrative emerging was one of abduction, not a runaway. But where was Sofía? Was she still alive? Or had something more sinister already happened? The timeline of events, as it unfolded, cast a chilling shadow over the small town. The authorities began to suspect that Sofía had been taken by force. Despite the large-scale search operation, drones, helicopters, and hundreds of officers, there was no sign of her. The town, once peaceful and quiet, now seemed suffocated by a collective fear. Sofia's disappearance was no longer just a family tragedy. It had become an enigma that consumed an entire community. As the days passed, the authorities began to piece together what little they knew. A pattern was beginning to form. The question that haunted everyone was simple, yet terrifying. Where was Sofía, and what had happened to her? Sofia's parents, Andres and Lady, were the emotional center of the investigation. Lady, in particular, was vocal in her distress. A mother's love for her child is often a force of undeniable strength, but Lady's grief was tempered with a profound sense of determination. She refused to sit idly by while her daughter's fate remained uncertain. Every hour, every minute that passed was excruciating. Her pain was not just from the loss, but from the uncertainty. She wanted answers, and she wanted them now. The emotional toll on the family was immense. Andres, the father, was initially more reserved in his reactions, his worry translating into action. His first instinct had been to search for Sofía on his own, and it was this drive that led to the discovery that she had never made it to their house. Yet, with each passing day, he, too, was consumed by the weight of what had happened. Lady's voice became a constant presence in the media. As the case grew more complex, her frustration boiled over. She spoke publicly about the lack of progress, her words laced with urgency. "We need answers," she pleaded. "We need them now." She advocated tirelessly for the authorities to do more. She wasn't just grieving. She was advocating for the life of her daughter, and she was prepared to fight for justice, no matter how long it took. Her public statements highlighted the growing emotional rift between the family and the investigation, as Lady began to suspect that the police weren't doing enough. The local police were under pressure, not just from the community, but from the media. The fact that Sofía was missing for days without any significant leads was not just a cause for concern. It was becoming an embarrassment for the authorities. It was clear that the investigation was being watched closely, and with little to show for their efforts, the stakes were raised. A breakthrough came when footage from a local security camera surfaced. The image was grainy, yet it clearly showed a young girl walking alone, a figure who, according to her parents, was undeniably Sofía. This footage was the first hard evidence that Sofía had indeed left her grandmother's house. However, it raised more questions than it answered. Why? Had she walked alone when she knew the dangers that might lie ahead? What had happened in the minutes that followed? It was the starting point of the criminal investigation, but it was far from a resolution. As the investigation expanded, one troubling detail began to emerge. Several witnesses had reported seeing a white car in the vicinity of where Sofía had disappeared. Authorities, now grappling with the grim possibility of abduction, began to investigate this lead more deeply. The car was connected to a local business, a pet shop owned by Brian Sneer Campo and his wife, Evelyn Rodas. It wasn't long before law enforcement took a closer look at the couple, particularly Brian, who was well known in the community. Brian Sneer Campo was described as a quiet, seemingly ordinary man, someone who had been living in Candelaria for a few months, but had quickly integrated into the local community. He had no previous connection to the Delgado family, and outwardly, there seemed to be no motive for any ill intentions. But as investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered unsettling information. Brian had a criminal history that raised immediate red flags. He had been involved in a prior abuse case, but due to a legal technicality, he had escaped justice. Now, as the investigation focused on his pet store, the first pieces of a much darker puzzle started to fall into place. The authorities began to believe that Brian had played a central role in Sofía's disappearance. Eyewitnesses started to recount strange encounters with him and his store. A report surfaced about a girl who had been lured into the store by Brian under suspicious circumstances, only to narrowly escape when a pet escaped, allowing her to run for safety. This information raised alarms. Sofía had loved animals, and it was easy to imagine how she could have been enticed into the store. Lady Zúñiga's suspicions were growing. She began to fear that Brian was not acting alone. She questioned the police's version of events, particularly Brian's claims about what had happened. She could not fathom how a man with such a criminal history had been allowed to remain free. Her instincts told her that there were more layers to this crime than the authorities were revealing. She was convinced that Brian's wife, Evelyn, had to know more than she let on. But despite Lady's pleas, Evelyn remained at the periphery of the investigation, with authorities hesitating to implicate her. Meanwhile, as the investigation intensified, Brian was brought in for questioning. The tension in the air was palpable. As the police pushed him for answers, the cracks in his story began to appear. It wasn't until the pressure mounted, and as Brian felt the walls closing in around him, that he finally confessed. The details of Brian's confession were harrowing. He admitted to having lured Sofía into his pet store, where he then attacked her, struck her in the head with a shovel, and, in his words, ended her life. The sheer brutality of the act shocked the investigators and the community alike. The details of Brian's confession were harrowing. He admitted to having lured Sofía into his pet store, where he then attacked her, struck her in the head with a shovel, and, in his words, ended her life. The sheer brutality of the act shocked the investigators and the community alike. Brian went on to explain how he disposed of Sofía's body, hiding it in a sugarcane field, attempting to cover his tracks by burning the remains. His confession, however, left more questions than answers. He claimed to have acted alone, but Lady was not convinced. She still suspected that he had help, that Evelyn, his wife, was somehow complicit. The authorities had their man, but the case was far from closed. Sofía's family remained haunted by the details of the crime, struggling with the cold reality that their beloved daughter had been murdered in such a horrific manner. Lady Zúñiga, however, remained unrelenting in her demand for justice. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a voice of defiance, determined to uncover every dark corner of this tragedy and ensure that those responsible would not escape accountability. Brian Sneer-Campo's confession, chilling as it was, raised more questions than it answered. Although he claimed to have acted alone, the circumstances surrounding Sofía's death were so horrific, so meticulously planned, that it seemed implausible he could have carried out the entire act without help. Lady Zúñiga, driven by a mother's instincts, refused to accept Brian's version of the story. She believed, with an unwavering certainty, that he had an accomplice. She began to question the police, subtly pushing them to investigate further, to look at everyone who might have been involved in the crime. Her suspicion primarily focused on Evelyn Rodas, Brian's wife, whom she believed might be more involved than the authorities were willing to acknowledge. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted to understanding how Brian had been able to carry out such a gruesome act without detection. Sofía's abduction, the murder, and the disposal of her body seemed far too calculated for a man who had been living under the radar for years. The authorities revisited Brian's past, digging into his criminal history, and they soon uncovered a disturbing pattern. Not only had he previously been involved in a sexual abuse case, but he also had a record of erratic behavior that seemed to suggest he had a deeply ingrained propensity for violence. Yet, despite the red flags, he had slipped through the cracks of the legal system, protected by a technicality in the law that had allowed him to avoid proper punishment for his prior offenses. This discovery caused a wave of outrage within the community and the public. How could someone with such a violent history be allowed to roam free, only to commit such a horrific crime again? The investigation team began to connect the dots, but they still lacked concrete evidence that Brian's wife, Evelyn, had been directly involved. Despite her proximity to the crime, there were no clear signs that she had played a role in Sofia's murder. Evelyn remained on the periphery of the investigation, and as of now, the police had little to go on to suggest her direct involvement. As investigators delved deeper into Brian's life, they uncovered unsettling details about his pet shop. His store was more than just a local business. It had served as a trap for other young children in the community. In one particularly troubling account, a young girl had managed to escape Brian's clutches after he tried to lure her into his shop with promises of free dog toys. This girl had managed to flee when a dog in the shop ran loose, giving her the opportunity to break free. She later provided a detailed description of Brian and the store, and investigators began to see a disturbing pattern of predatory behavior. It was clear that Brian had been targeting children, but no one had connected the dots until Sofia's disappearance brought his dark history into the light. Investigators now understood that Sofia's love for animals, particularly her affection for her pet dog Molly, had likely made her an easy target. The pet store was the perfect setting for Brian's manipulative tactics, where he could lure vulnerable children with promises of animal-related treats. Sofia's tragic fate seemed to be the culmination of a series of escalating offenses that had gone unnoticed by the community. As these revelations surfaced, the tension in the town grew. The horror of knowing that a predator had been living among them for months was overwhelming. The realization that the pet store had been a facade for much darker deeds led to widespread anger and disgust. As the investigation gained traction, the pressure on local authorities to solve the case grew exponentially. The community, already shaken by the disappearance of Sofia, was now facing a raw and devastating reality. A predator had been operating in their midst for months, preying on children under the guise of normalcy. The public demanded justice, and the authorities were under immense scrutiny to ensure that Brian would not escape punishment for his crimes. However, despite the mounting evidence against him, there were still complications that hindered the investigation's progress. One of the most significant issues was the question of whether or not Evelyn Rodas had any involvement in the crime. Lady Zuniga's gut feeling told her that Evelyn was more than just an innocent bystander. She had seen the way Evelyn reacted to the accusations, the subtle signs of guilt and evasion. Yet, the lack of direct evidence against her made it difficult for investigators to charge her. This ongoing ambiguity only heightened the emotional distress for Sofia's family, who struggled with the notion that someone so close to the perpetrator might have been complicit in the crime. Meanwhile, Brian's legal team began to mount a defense, arguing that his confession had been coerced. His attorneys attempted to paint a picture of him as a man overwhelmed by pressure and fear, though the horrific details of his confession seemed to undercut this defense. For Lady, every word of his confession felt like a slap in the face. She couldn't believe that the man who had taken her daughter's life was still being treated with such leniency. Her grief was now compounded by a deep-seated anger, and she pushed harder for the authorities to act with the same urgency she felt in her bones. While the investigation into Brian's background and his potential accomplices was ongoing, the search for Sofia's body continued. The authorities had already located a sugarcane field where Brian had claimed to have disposed of Sofia's remains, but retrieving the body proved to be an arduous task. The field, dense with tall plants and difficult terrain, made the search slow and painstaking. To make matters worse, the weather conditions were not favorable for a thorough search, with heavy rains complicating the recovery effort. Despite these obstacles, the authorities remained committed to finding Sofia's body, believing that it would be key in confirming the full extent of Brian's crimes. As days passed without progress, the emotional toll on Sofia's family continued to mount. Lady, in particular, was growing increasingly distraught. Every moment that passed without answers only deepened her sense of loss. It was as though time itself was conspiring against her, prolonging her agony while the authorities struggled to piece together the final details of the crime. As the weeks dragged on, the investigation reached a boiling point. Brian's story had been corroborated with evidence, but the case was far from complete. Lady, now more than ever, was pushing the authorities for a resolution. The question on everyone's mind was no longer just what happened to Sofía, but also who else might be involved. The emotional and investigative momentum continued to build toward an inevitable confrontation with the truth, a truth that would soon shatter the lives of everyone involved. The breakthrough came when the authorities, after weeks of painstaking searches and unrelenting pressure, finally uncovered Sofía's remains in the sugarcane field where Brian had confessed to hiding her. The conditions were gruesome. Brian had attempted to burn the body, but the fire had been largely ineffective due to the heavy rains. What was left were fragments of Sofía's body, and it was only through forensic investigation and DNA testing that the authorities were able to confirm her identity. The pain this caused her family was immeasurable. The hope that Sofía might still be alive was now definitively crushed. Lady Zúñiga, upon hearing the confirmation, fell into a profound, anguished silence. Her grief was palpable, raw, and intense as she held on to the final image of her daughter, the lively, cheerful girl who had been full of life and innocence. The image of Sofía's body, desecrated and discarded like garbage, haunted Lady every day. But it also fueled a deep rage. She had always suspected Brian's cruelty, but the reality of his actions was far more horrific than she had ever imagined. In the aftermath of the discovery, Brian Sneer-Campo's defense strategy began to crumble. His previous claims of having acted alone were quickly exposed as lies. As the investigation proceeded, authorities began to uncover even more disturbing facts about Brian's past behavior and his connections to the crime. His earlier confession, in which he described how he had lured Sofía into his pet shop, struck her with a shovel, and then disposed of her body, was corroborated with the evidence found at the scene. Yet, the depths of Brian's depravity seemed to extend beyond the murder itself. In his final statements to the authorities, Brian offered a chilling level of detail. He spoke not only about Sofía's death, but also about his history of predatory behavior. His actions revealed a deep-seated pattern of violence that had been ignored for years. Authorities discovered that Brian had previously been involved in a sexual assault case, but the legal system had failed to bring him to justice at the time, allowing him to continue his life without consequences. For Lady, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile the man who had once appeared so normal in the community with the cold-blooded murderer he truly was. She could not shake the haunting thought that, had the system acted sooner, Sofía might still be alive. The tragedy of her daughter's death became a constant reminder of the failure of justice, and Lady was determined to ensure that Brian would face the full consequences of his actions. With the confession of Brian Sneer-Campo, the emotions in the community ran high. The town of Candelaria, once quiet and peaceful, had been thrust into a maelstrom of grief and anger. As the details of Sofía's murder became public knowledge, the collective pain of the community deepened. Protesters gathered in the streets, calling for justice for Sofía and demanding stricter laws to protect children. The outrage was palpable, and the local authorities were faced with growing pressure to ensure that Brian would be held accountable for his heinous crime. The family, led by Lady Zuniga, also became vocal in the pursuit of justice. Ladies' call for justice became a rallying cry for those who had followed the case closely. She advocated for severe punishment for Brian, including the imposition of life imprisonment. She also called for legislative reform, urging lawmakers to pass laws that would protect children from sexual violence and ensure that criminals like Brian would never have the opportunity to harm anyone again. As Brian was brought to trial, the community held its breath. The entire town, the Delgado family, and the nation of Colombia watched as the case unfolded in court. Brian's defense tried to downplay his role in the crime, suggesting that he had been under duress or had acted out of some distorted sense of fear. But the overwhelming evidence against him, including his confession, the forensic findings, and the witness testimony, left little room for doubt. The trial culminated with a guilty verdict. Brian Sneer Campo was convicted of multiple crimes, including femicide, kidnapping, and the concealment of evidence. The sentence was harsh, as it should have been. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judgment was met with mixed emotions. While there was a sense of relief that justice had been served, there was also a deep sadness. The court's decision could not bring Sofía back. No sentence would ever undo the damage that had been done to her and her family. Though the trial had concluded, Lady Zuniga's fight was far from over. She continued to be a vocal advocate for the protection of children, using her daughter's tragic story to push for legal reforms in Colombia. Sofía's death had been a wake-up call to the nation, and Lady became a key figure in the movement to increase awareness of child abuse and improve the legal systems designed to protect minors. Her advocacy became a beacon of hope for other families who had suffered similar losses and had been failed by the system. Even after Sofía's death, Lady refused to let her daughter's memory fade. She made it clear that Sofía's life mattered, that her death would not be in vain. The ongoing legal and social battles fought by Lady brought a sense of purpose to her grief. She believed that, through her actions, she could ensure that Sofía's memory lived on in the fight for justice and reform. The town of Candelaria, too, began to heal, though the scars would remain. Sofía's story, her vibrant life cut short, became a part of the town's collective memory. The community had lost a beloved child, but they had also witnessed a horrific failure of justice that led to meaningful change. The people of Candelaria, once passive in their small-town routines, now found themselves questioning the safety of their children, the accountability of their institutions, and the very nature of their community. Sofía's funeral had been a somber affair, with thousands of people turning out to pay their respects. The town gathered to honor her, sending her off with a sea of white balloons that floated into the sky as a symbol of their grief, their hope, and their promise to never forget. Though Sofía had been taken too soon, the community's response ensured that she would never be forgotten. Her legacy, built not only from her innocence and brightness, but also from the movement for justice that followed her death, would live on forever. As the case finally came to a close, there was no sense of victory. There was no celebration, only the quiet resolve of a family who had lost everything. Sofía had been taken, but in her name, change had begun. And that was the only kind of solace that could ever be found in the aftermath of such a senseless tragedy.